What's up everyone, Code Shaver here to shave off complexity of code so you don't have to. I added some cool functions to the app, so let's check them out. Okay, so what we currently can do is we can load asynchronously, and then we added this sort of contextual menu that you can see in the Mac, and we can actually stop, and then we can load again. One other business rule that we have is that we cannot click when an app is open, and it also works in different directions, and then we can stop them one at a time and then start them again. So that sort of brings us, because in the end what we want to do is we have this window component, and I already added some of the bindings, and we want to create this sort of program that loads up. So in this case that would be the Google Chrome version, so to say. Okay, cool. But before we get there, let's just get this out of the way for now. We want to focus more on the code that is now there, the new code. So let's go to the doc item, what is it? Item, doc item component. Again, I'm using Angular here, but don't worry too much about that. It's really sort of not important. And actually, quite a lot has changed in the HTML, which is sort of quite specific to Angular, although it's quite similar to React and Vue. But in order not to really confuse you, we'll stay in the world of observables. So the only real thing you need to know is that we use this to sort of reference another observable in most cases. So this is the code that mostly been changed, and that's what we focus on. And we will look at like the techniques that we use to sort of get this thing to work. So one of the things that we did was we have this bounce done, but now it actually wraps its observable with merge. So before we just had sort of looking at the animation, and we sort of said, okay, take away everything that is animation and only look at the end width value of done. And now it seems that we also added this closed thing, and that actually seems to come from an entirely new observable called docItemClosed. And when I look at that one, it says that it was passed to a child, so that would be a child component in that case. And it's a subject of Boolean, so docItemClosed. So it seems to be that we have an on right click right here, and then we can do that right click, and then this component is sort of triggered down in a child to map to closed, and then whenever closed happens, it in the end maps to false here. So done is still mapping to true, meaning the bounce is done, and then sort of closed map to false, meaning the bounce is undone or not done anymore. And let's try that out. So basically we know that when we do stop, this subject gets a value emitted to it from the child by the event handler of stop. That is picked up here in the bounce done. And how merge works is that it basically allows you to merge two observables together. And then the value of E is whatever came from one of the two observables. And we can actually demonstrate that a little bit by being a little bit more specific about the types. And one way to do that is to use a wow, I lost my English there. TypeScript way, which asConst. And what asConst basically does is it sort of says this is really the literal value that it will be. It will never be another value, so you can take that. And that means that when we look at E, it's still string if we hover over it. But if we, let's say, remove this one, this bounce, the second observable, now of course this is going to scream at us, we can actually see that E is now the string literal, sorry about that, E is now the string literal of closed. And it is only because the intersection of the two observables is string, right? Because bounce is an observable of string. So if we want to give better typing here, we should do something about that bounce typing, so it's not the more generic string, but also something similar to that, to this. So we can use as const there as well to sort of investigate our own code a little bit. So let's go to this bounce. So this one hasn't really changed, and we can do the same trick here. So we say as const on the end with, and unfortunately, although we only pick up end with after the filter, TypeScript is not, or Rxjs in combination with TypeScript is not smart enough to then know what it should be after the filter. So it's not that it knows now that it should be either done or closed. Sorry about that. Let me just, yeah, there, this one. But what we can do as a sort of in between is actually also give this as const value. And now if we go back, we can see that he is very aware that the emission should be anything like this, like that, or this one. So just so you know, this is the union in TypeScript, meaning that it is either one of those. Okay, cool. Unfortunately, although we did filter out anything that isn't done here, TypeScript does not know that it is either done or closed, unfortunately. We can do that with the type predicate, but for now, I don't think that's really necessary. So, okay, so it seems to be that bounce done gets sort of, yeah, reset if you want to false, meaning we're sort of not done bouncing when we press the closed. And that kind of makes sense because if you do stop, you can actually bounce again. So yeah, we unclosed bounce, I guess. So that makes sense. So I guess we sort of check this and we understand what merge is. And please don't mix up merge and what we used before, combine latest, because combine latest really turns it into sort of a single emission where you can combine them and sort of make expressions of both of them. And merge is really the ability to have one come in and then the other after that, and then work with them. And that works great for this case. So we see that pattern here again, but let's talk a little bit more about these letters, because here it's called E, and E I usually use to talk about emission, so it's kind of broad, but A is actually a reference to action. And you might not be familiar with the Redux pattern, but the basic idea in Redux is that you sort of dispatch actions, or in NGRX, for example, similar sort of global state management. And if we think about state, we can kind of see a little bit of a pattern here, because what before was just simply the question, is bounce done? Yes or no? Now it becomes more of a manager role. So we sort of have this, I guess, done manager with merge, where it takes different values depending on which observable fired. Okay, so that's pretty handy. Another thing that we can do to sort of debug this in a more, let's say, academic way is using start with logic. So we can actually say that, okay, is the bounce done? Okay, it's done. This is just purely debugging. So we're just sort of purely debugging here. Okay, so the aim of this is not to sort of click around in the interface, but really to sort of really think about like, okay, we know that this one has sort of a Boolean return. So let's sort of just give it a value of done. And let's ask the essential question, meaning the name of the observable with an end value. So bounds done, yeah, true. Or a begin value without anything sort of admitting. So we say, yeah, bounds done is true. So if we say that, if we do that, we can actually see that we get the little dot. And that makes sense because when the bouncing is done, we know that the request is done because that's how we programmed it. So we know that we need to see the dot. So that makes sense. And now the show tooltip. So that's the next one. And it also kind of uses this merge logic before, but it kind of uses a different one. So it says tooltip clicked. And this one is not sort of mapping a value. So it kind of inherently needs to have a value. And this is basically true. So it's done here that it gets next into true, into the subject. So we know that the onWrite click basically says that we have tooltip clicked. And the basic answer that we need to ask ourselves is show tooltip. So again, to sort of go in debug style, we can look at the merge where it ends. And we know that this one does not have any pipe associated with it. It does have a pipe on the from event, which we'll talk about later. But maybe to take a little shortcut, we can just give it one and say start with. And then we say show tooltip. Yeah, let's show it. Okay, so before I save, let's just comment this one out. Because now we are saying show tooltip true. So we would imagine a tooltip being shown. But it's kind of that these two things are in connection to each other. So maybe this name isn't great, or we just have to do a little bit more research. But yeah, now they're both true, and we can actually see the tooltips on every one of the components. So what we can basically discern from that, what we of course already know, is that the idea is that when the bounce is done, we can start showing the tooltip if we clicked, right? And now it actually disappeared. And the reason why is because I probably just clicked in the interface somewhere. So if I refresh, I can see that it's there. And if I click, they all go away. Interesting. So it seems that the from event document click is basically exactly that. It's just a click anywhere on the document, and whatever value emission comes from there is then sort of being mapped to false. So then show tooltip is false, and clearly it's gone. So that makes sense. So if we sort of go back to basic functionality with all the information we now have, we can better formulate what is actually happening. So let's take away these debugging things. And we can understand that what we want is we want the ability to load up a program. Once it's done, we want to show a dot, and we want to disallow the ability to sort of click again. So what we know right now is that bounce done has the value of false. So what we can also discern from this is that somewhere in the HTML, there's a button with disabled logic on it. Okay, and this disabled logic is basically linked to this observable. And again, that is sort of Angular specific. In this case, I'm not going to go into details how I've done that, but you can do this in any framework quite easily. So yeah, but we know that from sort of reverse engineering it from just looking at this couple of lines of code. Then we know that now the bounce is done and the dot is shown, the program is loaded, and we know that in the future we will probably see some kind of program. But we also know that we now have the ability to actually do a right click on the tooltip, right? So we have the ability to say that we want the tooltip clicked, and that will sort of lead to a true situation. But that's strange because when we don't have any program loaded and we press write, we can't see any of that. So that is because, again, somewhere in the HTML, we specified that only basically show tooltip when bounce is done. So that's sort of the second condition, right? So although we definitely have this event firing, even right now, if I would do a log here, you could see that the log would fire all the time as I click on the right mouse. It's only because we actually have some if logic around the component of the tooltip that says, yeah, that's all nice, but as long as bounce is not done, you're not going to show. And then clearly here we do have it, kind of. And then the other thing we have is that we say that we want to sort of remove the tooltip whenever we click away. So that works. And that happens from the from event. And the stop logic finally happens in a child component as we passed this observable, this subject, to a child component. And we sort of read that child component submission. So apparently in the child component, we are handling a click here. And then whenever that click happens, we sort of pass it into the subject and we map that to closed. And we know now that closed is kind of like an action, if you're familiar with Rx or NGRX or Redux. So it's kind of like an action, you know? And that action is then being read here. And we also have improved our typing a little bit by actually using the as const. So some of the questions remain is this really a good way to describe the observable? Show tooltip, as we know, is quite conditional, and it's not actually true that if we say start with true, that it actually shows. So maybe we should change that name. But for now, I think it's kind of acceptable, so I'll leave it like that. So I hope this style of sort of reverse engineering it a little bit helps. I kind of wanted to do it because there were a lot of steps involved in HTML and other components, and I don't think that is really that interesting to understand the basic notion. I do think that one of the learnings is that, of course, after the last video, we could have gone in and immediately dive into the window, meaning this one. There was nothing stopping us from sort of linking those logics together. But I think that when it comes to Rxjs, it's really important to sort of take every step, because actually the ability to stop it is very important later on also when we have this component. So we needed some central place to sort of work with that. And that's the reason why I chose to do it before. So I hope you like this style of explaining it. Sometimes I will do live coding sessions when I think it really makes sense to use Rxjs. And sometimes I will sort of reverse engineer it a little bit, sort of code review style, if you want. So I hope it was clear. If not, don't hesitate to ask me any questions. I'll bring it back. There we are. I bring it back to full screen for sort of a goodbye. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe if you like this series.